The so-called Gunpowder Plot remains ever present in England today. Every year, on November the 5th, effigies are burned in remembrance of the attempted attack. Before each official opening of Parliament, guards still search the cellars where, in 1605, the gunpowder was hidden that was meant to destroy the Parliament building. Across the world, the mask has become a symbol of resistance to oppression, bearing the likeness of the co-conspirator Guy Fawkes. Had the attack succeeded, the consequences would have been catastrophic. That much is widely known. Yet even the conspirators themselves had no real sense of just how disastrous the results of their scheme would have been, whether in the short, medium, or long term. Later catastrophes, such as the Great Fire of 1666, together with modern simulations, allow us to gauge what might have happened. The number of victims would probably have reached into the tens of thousands, as we shall see at the end of this video. Welcome back to Lemmy History. Before we get into the topic, let me briefly address the elephant in the room, the voice. The provider of my AI voice has informed me that the model I am using will no longer be supported as of December 15th, 2025. That is why this is now my voice. I decided to go with this one, even so I had another plan originally. But back to the Gunpowder Plot. It was a religiously motivated plan of attack. Catholics intended to blow up Parliament during its opening session, thereby wiping out the entire political elite of the kingdom. King James I and his eldest son, Henry, were both present that day. The conspirators also expected the king's second son, Charles, to attend Parliament. Yet they had also devised an alternative plan. If he were not present, they intended to seize him. In addition, the conspirators aimed to gain control of James's daughter, Elizabeth. She was to be placed upon the throne as their puppet. In this way, England was to be restored as a Catholic realm. For this purpose, the conspirators also counted on Catholic uprisings breaking out across the country once news of the successful attack spread. Or, in the words of Guy Fawkes, the aim was to blow the Protestant king and his family back to Scotland. Despite the fact that Guy Fawkes is the most famous of the conspirators, and that November the 5th is also known as Guy Fawkes Day, he was not actually the leader of the plot. That role belonged to Robert Catesby. Fawkes, born in York in 1570, was the group's man for the rough work. As a soldier, he fought on the continent for Catholic Spain against the Dutch. He even tried, in vain, to persuade the Spanish monarchs to invade England. During his years as a mercenary, he met Thomas Wintour, who later brought him back to England and introduced him to Catesby. Together with John Wright and Thomas Percy, the three men formed the original core of the conspiracy. This inevitably raises the question of why we remember Fawkes above all the others. One reason is undoubtedly that he was the first to be captured. Fawkes was tasked with lighting the gunpowder. Moreover, he resisted torture for a relatively long time, giving his fellow conspirators precious time to escape. Even in death, he managed to defy the plans of the authorities and achieve a small victory, a point we will examine in detail later in this video. Fawkes is not remembered primarily as a Catholic, but as a man who went to his death for his convictions, enduring torture in order to protect his friends. This has earned him a measure of respect. The old jest that Fawkes was the only man ever to enter Parliament with honest intentions remains well known to this day. On Guy Fawkes Day, therefore, it is no longer the effigy of a failed terrorist that is burned, but rather that of a figure who represents a threat to peace in the present. The symbol that Guy Fawkes has become carries such weight that his name has overshadowed all the other conspirators. Yet this heroization and romanticization of Fawkes must not obscure the true nature of the plan. The conspirators knew full well that innocent lives would be lost. Catesby even asked the Jesuit Henry Garnet in the summer of 1605 whether such an act could ever be morally justified. At their first meeting, the priest conceded that, under certain circumstances, the deaths of innocents might be excused. At a second meeting, a few weeks later in Essex, Garnet presented Catesby with a letter from the Pope expressly forbidding the plot's execution. Later, the Jesuit Oswald Tessemond informed him that Catesby had spoken about the plan in confession. At a third meeting, Garnet again attempted to dissuade him, though he did not admit that he knew the details, since he considered them bound by the secrecy of confession. In short, we are dealing with a group of men who were fully aware that they would be sacrificing innocents, and who acted in defiance of their own religious authorities. It was an act of terrorism carried out by men who believed they knew better than anyone else. And in this, Guy Fawkes was no exception. At first, the conspirators had placed great hopes in King James I. Percy, who came from one of the old noble families of England like Catesby, expected positive change after personal conversations with the king. They believed that under James, the situation of Catholics would improve compared to the harsh days of Elizabeth I. When matters turned out differently, Catesby resolved to act. The original plan was to blow up Parliament in 1604. The 5 conspirators met for the first time on May the 20th of that year at the Duck and Drake Inn. There, they swore oaths of secrecy, after which the men celebrated a Catholic Mass together with John Gerard. From then on, they continued to meet in various taverns and inns across the city, using these inconspicuous gatherings to press ahead with their planning. A decisive early step was taken on June the 9th. Percy was admitted into the circle of the gentlemen pensioners, the Royal Guard of Honor. This gave the conspirators access to sensitive areas in Westminster to which they otherwise would never have been admitted. Percy, for example, was able to rent a house near the Prince's Chamber, an anteroom of the House of Lords. This provided the conspirators with a base of operations within striking distance of their intended target. Fawkes, the group's demolition expert, could now move in and out without attracting attention. He posed as Percy's servant and used the name John Johnson. Their determination hardened when Parliament passed new anti-Catholic laws. However, on July the 7th, 1604, Parliament was adjourned due to fears of a major plague outbreak in London. For this reason, the men also left the city, planning to return in October, when Parliament was scheduled to meet again in winter. During this period, Catesby decided to add Robert Keyes to the group. Sources describe Keyes as desperate and heavily in debt. His role was to oversee Catesby's house in Lambeth, where weapons and gunpowder were to be stored temporarily. Keyes's wife was employed in the household of the Catholic Lord Mordaunt, who himself had a seat in Parliament. Catesby assumed that Keyes shared qualities with Fawkes that were indispensable to the plot's success. He was capable of looking after himself. When the conspirators met again in London in October 1604, Catesby had little difficulty persuading his allies that Keyes should remain in the circle. Another man, Thomas Bates, had to be admitted unintentionally. A servant of Catesby, he had stumbled upon the plot by chance and thus had to be included. According to the official account, the conspirators now resolved to dig a tunnel beneath the House of Lords. This is what the report states, yet the authenticity of this claim has been repeatedly questioned over time. The tunnel story rests on a statement allegedly made by Thomas Wintour. Guy Fawkes, however, said nothing about any tunnel during his interrogations. Moreover, the soil beneath Westminster would have made such an excavation extremely difficult to accomplish in the short time available, especially as none of the men had any experience with that kind of work. During the supposed excavation, the men are said to have discovered that a cellar lay beneath the House of Lords. Allegedly, they halted their digging when they became aware of noises nearby. At that point, the widow of the previous tenant cleared out the cellar. For the conspirators, this was an ideal development. The vault was far more suitable than any tunnel could have been, and, crucially, it was available for rent. According to the official report, they therefore abandoned the tunnel scheme. If no tunnel ever existed, however, it remains unclear how the conspirators initially intended to bring the gunpowder beneath Parliament. Sadly, we can no longer reconstruct the matter with certainty, as the Palace of Westminster looks entirely different today. The modern Parliament sits in buildings dating from the 19th century. Without the tunnel, it is also uncertain how the conspirators first learned of the empty cellar. Historians have long debated the truth of the tunnel story. Some argue that it was a convenient piece of propaganda inserted into the official narrative to make the plot appear even more elaborate and dangerous than it truly was. Others suggest that the government had an interest in portraying the conspirators as both ingenious and reckless, in order to heighten the sense of divine deliverance when the scheme was foiled. What is clear is that no physical trace of the tunnel was ever recorded, leaving modern scholars to doubt whether it ever existed at all. Once again, fortune seemed to favor the conspirators. On December the 24th, 1604, the Crown announced that the opening of Parliament would be postponed yet again. The new date was set for October the 3rd, 1605. The lease for the cellar vault began on March the 25th, 1605, the first day of the new year according to the calendar then in use. Thanks to this repeated delay, the group now had ample time to transport the gunpowder into the vault without undue haste. Guy Fawkes suspected, rightly, that security measures would tighten as the eventual opening of Parliament drew near. With the start of the new year, the circle of conspirators also expanded. John Grant, Christopher Wright, and Robert Wintour were brought into the scheme, adding fresh resources to the project. Robert Wintour's estate, Huntington Court, had already served as a refuge for Catholic priests in the past. Moreover, he was married to Gertrude, daughter of John Talbot of Grafton, linking the conspirators by marriage to another prominent family. In total, 36 barrels of gunpowder were to be packed beneath the House of Lords. In the spring of 1605, the first barrels were carried into the vault, though the precise number is no longer known. On July the 20th, a further 16 barrels were added, yet their efforts were once again disrupted. News soon arrived that Parliament's opening had been postponed once more. The conspirators abandoned their operations in London, waiting for the new date, November the 5th. At that point, however, their streak of luck began to run out. Guy Fawkes returned to the metropolis on the Thames at the end of August and made a disturbing discovery. The gunpowder, stored for months in the damp vault, had been decayed. To salvage the plan, he arranged for fresh barrels to be delivered, though the exact number remains unknown. For a long time, historians assumed that the damaged powder would never have ignited, yet a careful reconstruction of the plot in 2005 demonstrated the opposite. Even the decayed barrels would have exploded with devastating force. The concealment of the cache was strikingly careless. Fawkes simply stacked firewood in front of the barrels to disguise them. By this point, the ever-expanding group of conspirators was beginning to create new difficulties. Some members were troubled by moral scruples, which led to the conversations between Robert Catesby and Father Henry Garnet already discussed. At the same time, secrecy became increasingly fragile. To this day, suspicions persist that by late summer or early autumn, at least certain family members had already been informed of the design. One reason was the need for elaborate travel arrangements. Several conspirators were expected to leave for the continent after the explosion in order to alert Catholic courts abroad. The goal was to ensure that a new government in England would quickly form strong Catholic alliances, thereby stabilizing its position after the coup. Ships therefore had to be secured, and family households quietly prepared for departure. Despite these problems, the conspiracy continued to grow. The preparations were costly. Due to the repeated postponements of the opening of Parliament, expenses far exceeded what the men had originally calculated. Catesby therefore brought in his cousin, Francis Tresham, on the 14th of October, 1605, who had inherited a large fortune. The two men had grown up together. Catesby, however, quickly learned that his cousin had already expended nearly the entirety of his inheritance. The head of the conspirators asked Tresham for £2,000, but he was forced to refuse. Later, he would only be able to provide £100 to Thomas Wintour. In his interrogations, however, Catesby's cousin explained his refusal on moral grounds. He claimed to have asked the conspirators whether he was not endangering his salvation. To justify himself, Tresham also pointed out that he had relocated his family to London shortly before the planned attack, an act hardly befitting a guilty man. Yet, the Crown's interrogation specialists were not persuaded. We will return to this point later. Shortly after Tresham's accession, Lord Monteagle received an anonymous warning letter. The Baron testified that he had received the letter on the 26th of October. This was the text. "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be contemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm, for the danger is past, as soon as you have burnt the letter, and I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you. We do not know for certain who wrote it. There are three main theories. First, it could have been Tresham. The letter was written after he joined the group, and Catesby's cousin was known to be mentally unstable. A second possibility concerns the Keyes couple. It is conceivable that Robert wished to save his wife's employer, or that she acted of her own accord. Thirdly, there is speculation that Lord Monteagle somehow learned of the conspiracy by other means and wrote the letter himself to deflect suspicion. Among historians, however, this latter theory has found little support. The astute Cecil saw an opportunity. He was a staunch Protestant and more than willing to take decisive action against Catholics. He therefore chose to delay informing the king. Such a step would have spared the conspirators. Percy was hunting with the monarch and would have learned immediately that the plot had been uncovered. His allies would then have been warned. Cecil knew nothing of this, but he knew his king. James was a man who liked to consider himself the most intelligent person in the room. The monarch must therefore have believed that he would make all the crucial decisions. When James returned to London at the beginning of November, his leading minister presented him with the letter. Cecil concealed the length of time he had possessed it. James decided that the basement room should be searched. This took place on the 4th of November, 1605, at noon. The soldiers encountered Fawkes, but saw only firewood. They therefore paid no further attention to the supposed John Johnson. Since they returned to the king empty-handed, James ordered a more thorough search. The disaster was set in motion. The men discovered the gunpowder and arrested Fawkes. They were ordered to bring him directly to the king. Percy learned that the plot had been exposed and fled the city with most of the other conspirators. James could not make Fawkes talk. All he heard from the prisoner was how much the man hated him. He therefore transferred him to the Tower, placing him in the hands of Sir Edward Coke. The king ordered that torture be used. However, James decided that gentler methods should be tried first, methods designed to leave no permanent physical damage. Should Fawkes refuse to speak, harsher torture could then be employed. It is very likely that Fawkes was exposed to the horrors of the rack. The signature on his confession strongly suggests that he was no longer able even to hold a pen. The demolition expert of the conspiracy endured 2 days of agony before breaking. His interrogations took place mainly in the council chamber of the king's house in the Tower. To this day, a plaque commemorates all the names of the conspirators. Fawkes gave his allies a sufficient lead to reach their designated places of escape. The men attempted to persuade the Catholics in the countryside that the plot had succeeded and that they must rise up. However, this did not happen. Those who learned of the plan were horrified by its cruelty and feared the worst for those involved if the crown sought revenge. Even family members turned away. The conspirators eventually found themselves virtually alone at Holbecky House. Here, Catesby narrowly escaped death when a load of gunpowder was ignited while he stood too close to the fire. What the men did not suspect was that Fawkes had already revealed their whereabouts. 200 armed men soon surrounded the building. Catesby, Percy, and 2 others died in the ensuing shootout. In the following days, all the principal conspirators were finally arrested. By the end of January 1606, all those involved had been captured. The trial of the conspirators began on the 27th of January, 1606, but Tresham was already dead by that time. He had succumbed to illness in the Tower in December. There remains speculation as to whether the deceased had played a role in hastening his own end. He had persuaded the Tower staff that his own doctors could treat him, and he regularly received visits from his wife and a servant. None of the men should have harbored illusions about what awaited them. They would be condemned as traitors, which meant they would be hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled, possibly emasculated, and quartered. None of the men would have wished this fate. One man who certainly deliberately avoided this torment was Fawkes. After the noose had been placed around his neck, he unexpectedly jumped from the gallows, breaking his neck. Yet, like Tresham, he was posthumously disemboweled and quartered. The other conspirators endured this fate alive until they were finally beheaded. Their heads were impaled and displayed publicly as a warning. James passed a law decreeing that the nation should commemorate the attack every year on the 5th of November. Originally, this was planned for only 20 years. However, the commemoration was resumed at the end of the 17th century and evolved into the spectacle that continues today on November the 5th. The reconstruction of the explosion, which also exists as a YouTube video, demonstrated that the force of the blast would have been directed almost entirely upwards. The House of Lords and the surrounding buildings would have been completely destroyed. During the test, debris was found several hundred meters away. In the experiment, dummies acted as representatives for visitors attending the opening of Parliament. Their condition made it clear that no one would have survived. In addition, windows throughout Westminster would have shattered. Due to the opening of Parliament, the district had been flooded with visitors. The barons and deputies arrived with their retinues. Thousands of people were within the direct blast radius on the 5th of November, 1605. Moreover, burning debris would most likely have caused further fires. About 60 years later, at the time of the Great Fire, between 300,000 and 400,000 people lived in the region we now call London. In 1605, the population was probably not significantly smaller. At that time, the Great Fire consumed more than 10,000 houses and left about 80,000 people homeless. Fortunately, only a few people lost their lives in that disaster. In the case of the Gunpowder Plot, however, the outcome would likely not have been so merciful. The explosion would have caused numerous smaller fires across the city simultaneously. Furthermore, reserves of gunpowder were still stored in Westminster in the Tower. There was a real danger that these supplies would have ignited as well. After the Great Fire, the Tower underwent renovations to reduce this risk. Thousands of people would have died instantly in and around Parliament. Countless others would probably have fallen victim to the ensuing fires. England would not only have been decapitated politically, London itself would have suffered devastating destruction. In the long term, the number of victims would probably have risen drastically. As we know from similar destruction in our own time, dust and debris cause people to fall incurably ill. In 1605, people were far less aware of such dangers than we are today. In addition, the English economy would have suffered a devastating blow. London was already the economic center of the country at that time. The metropolis served as the primary transshipment point for trade. There was a real risk that all these activities would have come to a halt overnight. England and Scotland would probably have slipped into a deep recession. Politically, the conspirators would likely have achieved the exact opposite of their goal. Ronald Hutton has dealt with this question extensively. He assumes that England would have become a puritanical absolutist monarchy. Catholicism would have been eradicated entirely. In fact, royal soldiers were already tasked with protecting the dwellings of Spanish emissaries when the population learned of the plot. So great was the anger directed at Catholics. The fact that the first suspicion fell on Spain also reveals another danger. If the attack had succeeded, it might have led to war. In summary, a devastating chain reaction would have been set in motion that could have claimed countless victims. Presumably, the consequences would have been felt throughout Europe, especially since the conspirators had no means of bringing Charles under control. He would have ascended to the throne at the age of 4. This would have meant the rule of a regent, which, historically, always brought additional uncertainty. The actual consequences were comparatively moderate, but even they were grave enough. A whole series of new laws were enacted, specifically directed against Catholics. James was already convinced, as King of Scotland, that demonic forces operated in the world. He therefore ensured a comprehensive witch hunt. As early as 1599, he had written his own book on the subject. After the thwarted attack, he continued to obsess over this issue. Many innocent women, and some men, paid with their lives because of it. When we heroize and romanticize historical figures, we must not forget that they were real people. Their actions had consequences. In some cases, those consequences could be devastating, as in this case. It is fortunate that the attack was prevented, but that does not make the plot, nor those behind it, any less repulsive. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.